I have had a number of you in my course, Undivided Europe. So for those of you, oh, hi, Tim, who've taken my course, the first part of this will be some review. How many of you have experience with the Chapel Expert Survey, reading articles, kind of consuming it? So we'll spend a little bit of time on that, which I think will be helpful for some of your future projects and classes as well. And I do want to take some time to talk about the impact of Russia's war against Ukraine on European politics and also on these so faithful Italian elections. How many of you agree with me that the future of Europe depends on the Italian elections on September 24th? I mean, the future of Europe is always shaped by every event, but this one feels to me like very consequential. And anyway, we'll talk about that in the talk. So I'm going to get the 30-minute signal. I'm going to try not to talk too long, so because I do want to have a lot of time for Q&A. So I'm going to start with a so the purpose of this project, it really started out trying to understand how it was possible that we had such rapid democratic backsliding in two countries, well, first in Hungary, then in Poland, two countries that had been really the front runners, the standard bearers, the poster children of political change and democratization in post-communist Europe after 1989. And I always say this to my classes, for people my age, so I'm about to turn 53, I was in college, I was a junior in college when 1989 happened. And you had the unexpected and almost entirely peaceful end of the Cold War, disintegration of the Soviet Union, and this moment where you had a lot of newly sovereign, newly free states embarking on this path to liberal democracy or democratization. And it was just an incredibly hopeful time in international politics. And I think for you, there really hasn't been some moment of unexpected hopefulness. It's more been, I think, a case of world events that are discouraging and distressing. And so there are a lot of political scientists who decided, a lot of young people who decided to become political scientists to study comparative politics, international relations at this moment in time in the early 90s when the world seemed so hopeful. Now, there were a lot of misconceptions about how hopeful it really was, and some of us ended up leading American foreign policy on some really unfortunate side excursions in places like Iraq. But the general thought, or the general takeaway from Poland and Hungary in the 90s was, we can, if people rise up against an authoritarian regime and topple that regime through people power, and then you have free and fair elections, you're going to get governments that are pro-democracy, generally pro-minority rights, and pro-Western. We love the USA. You could even say that, American foreign policy, we were happy. As comparative politics scholars, we had, I would say, a much more subtle view in that I was always, from the very beginning, really interested in the variation in outcomes. So 89 to 91, you have all these states leaving authoritarian rule, whether they were in the Soviet Union or just inside the Soviet bloc. The authoritarian, totalitarian regime collapses, and you have regime change. But where that went, there was a huge variety, right? And countries like Poland and Hungary seem very promising, were very promising, are very promising. Those democratic changes, many of them survived, at least in Poland. But other countries, for many other countries, that political change was about replacing one kind of authoritarian regime with another. So that was far more common. And the path of many countries away from authoritarianism has been really long and difficult. But Poland and Hungary, were really the ones in Czech Republic that were least expected to see democratic backsliding. So then you think about this as a post-communist story, right? That you had democracies in post-communist Europe that are new, that are weak, they're young, they don't have these strong institutions, right? But by the middle of the 2010s, right, by 2015, we see that this kind of attack on democratic institutions by incumbents is also happening in some of the world's oldest democracies, right? The United Kingdom, the United States. And so suddenly the picture becomes much more common than just to say these post-communist countries have weak institutions. So then the question is sort of why? And a lot of scholars and journalists too, and think tankers have thought of the 2010s as this moment, what is like this wave of populism, right? Where a lot of populist politicians have seen a rise in their support. But I like to start with this definition of populism because in reality, all politicians, or 99% of them, are populist, right? In some way, in that they promise to defend the interests of the people. Bernie Sanders is a populist. I don't think he has an agenda to destroy democratic institutions. Some people call Macron a populist. The basic idea of populism is that you're basically saying to the people, look, a lot of the policy making that's happened so far has been done by elites to favor elites. And we're going to be different from all those other politicians of the left, the right, the center, by foregrounding privilege in your interests, the interests of the ordinary people. No, it doesn't sound so bad to me in a country, when we think about the rise in income quality and the intensity of private power related to wealth in this country and around the world. I think things like regulations, re-regulation to protect consumers, for example, against big banks would be an example of a kind of populist promise, for example, that Obama made, in fact, to sort of re-regulate to protect the consumer. When I was your age, college students would get, I don't want to exaggerate, but probably a credit card offer per week in their mailbox. And a lot of my friends filled these things out, and it was pretty disastrous. The terms were terrible, et cetera. So that was a case of, deregulation to help the big banks, but certainly wasn't helping young people. Okay, so you promise to defend the people against the establishment, and you argue that elites are protecting and expanding their own privileges at the expense of ordinary people. It's helpful always, I feel, and even if I say it a lot, nobody does it, to modulate populism, right? Right now, if you read a journal, if you read an article, even by my esteemed colleagues, populism is often used to describe like what we would think of as far right, politicians who are attacking women's rights, LGBTQ rights, politicians who are trying to destroy the independent judiciary, et cetera. But that's not all the kinds of populism, right? There's a varieties of populism. And a lot of it depends on who are the people that you're claiming that you're going to defend, and who are the enemies that you're saying you're going to defend people from. Now, all populists seem to have it in a bit for international institutions, big banks. I mean, there's some enemies that are somewhat consistent across different populist parties. But populism on the economic left has generally been, so here I'm talking about the last 10 years, I'm talking about mainly Europe and also, the US always comes in. Latin America is more complicated, but we see certainly, Brazil, which is populism on the economic right and all left. So populism on the economic left, the people are all of those, like the 99%, right? The people who have suffered because of neoliberal economic policies, deregulation, reducing the power of workers, and essentially all the policies that have helped contribute to rising and stunning inequality in our country and others. And the enemy are the financial establishment, Wall Street, and so forth. Now, in Europe, and here I really am talking about Europe, and I think the US fits as well, if we're thinking about Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Generally, populist parties on the economic left have taken an inclusive view of the people. So everyone who's economically disadvantaged is part of the deserving people that deserve, the real people, the authentic people, the deserving people that that should have better representation. And so generally speaking, if you look at like Podemos in Spain or Syriza in Greece, these parties are not using ethnic scapegoating against immigrants or minorities or domestic minorities or ethnic minorities. So that's sort of hopeful. Now, the five-star movement in Italy is a little more ambiguous on this measure, but I'll show you in a little bit. So populism on the culture right is what I call ethnopopulism. And it was first kind of, my colleague Erin Jenny at the CEU wrote this little article about, hey, you know, maybe we should be calling this ethnopopulism. And I read that article, like, yes. And here, you know, the people are cast as part of an ethnicity, culture, nation, religion, race, or even civilization that's under threat. So if anybody, if George Soros is involved as a boogeyman, it's ethnopopulism. I don't care if it's a mild, like even here in North Carolina in some local race a couple of years ago, George Soros was evoked. I was like, really? George Soros, such a mighty man. For those of you who don't know, he is a man who became wealthy because of financial things he did, investment banking and stuff, and has used his wealth to fund mainly education for East Europeans after '89, the Central European University in Budapest, and also scholarships for many, including Viktor Orban, who then has used him as his number one boogeyman. So ethnopopulism, kind of what is it? It's anti-pluralist, meaning, you know, we don't want to respect the plurality of voices and groups and differences in our society. We want to dictate who has access to the public space based on usually what's called traditional values. And it's profoundly majoritarian, meaning that ethnopopulists sort of claim, and if you listen to Viktor Orban in Hungary or Meloni in Italy, she's definitely like this. Even Boris Johnson in the UK. Sort of making the majoritarian claim, right? But as long as, you know, we can get 51% of the people to vote for something in a referendum, often a referendum that's very dodgy in all kinds of ways, that's democracy, right? The people have spoken. It's so easy to rig that, right? So Viktor Orban's always saying, you know, the people, this is what the people want. But when you look inside at how he conducts elections and referendums, and now the playing field is so small. In the US, we also have a kind of profoundly majoritarian message in that, which is ironic because many of the policies that ethnopopulists have been pushing through are pushed through because of minority rule. And we've been talking about that in my class, which is really interesting. So how do they get more support? Like in the last decade, we've just seen the power of these appeals, right? Where it's a populist message, like we're gonna stick up for the ordinary person. Now they hardly ever do, so that's another part of it. Like, I don't want to say never, but generally speaking, once the power, they do not make things better for the ordinary person. But on top of that, essentially saying you are being disadvantaged because the LGBTQ community is somehow destroying values in our country, or because migrants are taking your jobs or destroying the ambiance in our towns, and so on and so forth. And the enemy this is, I think, really interesting because the enemy varies a lot, but it's a combination of domestic groups that are labeled as culturally harmful. So feminists, LGBTQ, people who help refugees, that's a whole group that's attacked, for example. Refugees themselves, migrants. So taking a look at this, so this is from the Chapel Exit Survey already in 2019. So we're getting close to doing the next round, which will be super interesting. On this axis, you have the salience of immigration rhetoric. It's not actually your immigration position, but just how important immigration is to your campaign. And then here you have the salience of anti-establishment rhetoric, which is it's a simple proxy for populism. There could be better ones. Scholars have worked on that, but I think it works pretty well. And so here you see Fidesz, which is Viktor Orban's party in Hungary, extremely anti-establishment, extremely high salience of immigration, anti-immigration rhetoric. And this triangle means that the party opposes the European Union. Here you have the Law and Justice Party in Poland. This is the Freedom Party in Austria, which worries me a lot. It worries me a lot because this is supposed to be the mainstream conservative party in Austria, right? And look how the salience of immigration rhetoric is incredibly high because that party is almost as vicious in terms of scapegoating immigrants, especially and almost exclusively immigrants of color, as the ethno-populist far-right party. And here are troublemakers from the Italian elections, the Brothers of Italy and Lega. Now in 2019, Brothers of Italy had much less support. I think they have like 5%, and today in the polls it's up to 25%. So right now, 25% for Brothers of Italy, and LN is Lega, which is Salvini's party, which is polling at around 10%. So, conceivably they could form a majority in the Italian parliament. That's not happening. Be optimistic. Okay, and here's Greece and Spain, in Greece, the salience of immigration, it's, given Greece having so much immigration, you see high salience for all parties, but you see Syriza as pro-EU and, less it's still, it is an anti-establishment party. It came to being as a populist left party. And here's Spain, which has always been super nice with Vox on the rise. France and UK. France is kind of a completely different party system with Macron's La République En Marche having kind of blown up traditional left-right and rearranged the whole party system. And here you have the Conservative Party in the UK. Now, I mentioned, this is a terrible slide, but I'll tell you what it says. One of the things which has been so clear about these ethno-populist parties is that they vilify groups that they claim are culturally harmful. So you see that very strongly, like anti-LGBTQ, anti-women, feminism. And when it comes to immigration, they tend to choose almost exclusively to vilify immigrants and refugees of color, mainly Muslim refugees. And so you see that, like in Poland, for example, which has had over the last 15, 20 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainian and Belarusian and other workers coming into work. There's a booming economy, a lot of construction. That's never been politicized and still isn't. But the idea of maybe 10 or 20 or 100 refugees from the war in Syria became like completely blown up as, this is going to destroy our culture. This is a terrible safety threat. So it was really shocking how they were able to politicize and vilify a group that was essentially completely absent in their own countries. Now in Italy, of course, there's much more immigration that comes in France, where Le Pen got 40% of the vote last spring. So there the immigration is much more, at least exists. And so it makes more sense to politicize it. But you see here that for many of these parties, what essentially this chart shows you is that they're taking the anti-Islam rhetoric is very salient for their party. So that our experts said essentially, when it comes to how they present themselves for the voters, they appeal to the voters, anti-Islam rhetoric is very salient. The only exception is the British Conservative Party that scored more mildly on that. So that's depressing, right? So ethnopopulism, why use this term? I already mentioned it, to speed up a bit. This is like a strategy to win votes, but also to justify the concentration of power and democratic backsliding once in office. So the Trump administration is a textbook case of this, right? That sort of ethnopopulism that they use to help get votes, they also use it to try to justify a lot of attacks on democratic institutions. And it's different from ethnic nationalism. You know, nationalism studies has been a really important part of comparative politics, especially for the last 30 years. And ethnic nationalism was the term that everyone was using. But see, ethnic nationalism, when I was, for example, doing my research in the 90s and 2000s, far-right parties that are nationalist, you know, for them, the enemy tends to be the adjoining and intermingled nations. So the far right in Slovakia, their number one agenda was how much they hated the Hungarians, both in Budapest and the Hungarian minority in Slovakia. Meaning they saw this as a threat to Slovakia, to the nation, to the culture, etc. This kind of focus, you know, on adjoining and intermingled nations makes sense because nationalism and the wars of the 20th century sort of brought these nations into conflict. But that's not what's happening now, right? The enemies that Viktor Orban invokes, or Boris Johnson, or Leszek Kaczynski in Poland, those enemies are not adjoining and intermingled nations in the same way. It's international institutions, it's George Soros, it's big banks as well. And then it's these domestic groups, right, that are part of the nation. Oh, well, disagree with, obviously that's ridiculous. You know, feminists are, they fight against quote unquote gender ideology, and feminism is sort of at the core of the Polish Law and Justice Party and how they campaign to the voters. And it's not, you know, a far-right party in the 90s in Poland would have focused on Germany, you know. Germans are going to come back and get us. That would have been a kind of traditional go-to for the far-right. So the enemies are not neighboring nations, but these broad cultural and civilizational threats, and it's much more flexible. And this flexibility has actually allowed, you know, Putin to become, you know, part of the external actors who are allegedly helping these countries to, you know, these parties and these countries in their fight to preserve traditional values. Hopefully, we will see an attenuation of that, right? The ability of Putin and the Kremlin to, fund these parties directly and do all kinds of things. Just the information environment to boost these narratives that they're putting out there. All these ethno-populist parties have gotten money directly from the Kremlin. And even in the UK, there's amounts of evidence that there was a lot of Russian money coming in to fund the campaign. And it makes sense, right? Because Putin wants to destabilize Europe, wants to undermine European integration. Okay, so I already covered that. Why not use right-wing populism instead? It's about flexibility, and it's also about they increasingly have policies that are left-wing. What's interesting is that, you know, if a social democratic politician was in the room right now, they would say these policies are absolutely not left-wing. You know, this is just vote buying. I think we have to be a little more careful there in that some of them have, you know, put forward very nativist but redistributive policies, right? We're going to strengthen the welfare state. We're going to give you more, but only if you're a real French person, right? So Le Pen in France supports a stronger, more redistributive welfare state, but only for the real French people. In Poland, they put in place a very generous payment for children. Each child, you know, you get money every month. And that is, you know, vote buying. I'm sure that there are a lot of, you know, young families trying to balance the budget, the family budget, who might have voted for the Law and Justice Party because they didn't want to stop to those payments, which makes total sense to me. And that doesn't mean that they also, we may have disagreed strongly with the kind of cultural arguments that this party was making. The upshot in Poland is that we have seen a dramatic decrease in child poverty and a decrease in inequality. So they have had some successful policies. Okay, so here just a couple, before we move on, just a couple of charts to give you a sense of how the Chapel Expert Survey helps us understand the axes of contestation in these party systems. So here you have kind of the traditional left-right economic position. And that's about redistribution, right? About how much you tax and spend, how much of a welfare state you want, in terms of support for people in unemployment, pensions, child policies, etc. And the interesting thing is that when we say left and right, I'm sure we do it all the time, we call parties left and right. Traditionally, that was the main thing that meant, right? Left and right was about how much should the state be involved in the market and redistribution? How much regulation and redistribution? This is what we call the TAM gal. So TAM stands for Traditional Authoritarian Nationalist, and gal stands for Green Alternative Libertarian. And so on this, these Polish parties are actually, this is nice. I'm always happy when I see that there's some competition on economic policy. I mean, not a lot, but our experts are able to sort of distinguish that there is a difference. Now you see that the Law and Justice Party, which is the far right party, if you were reading an article in the newspaper, they would call it far right or maybe conservative. They're definitely on the left when it comes to economic policy in terms of redistribution. Always have been there. This is all about identity. Right? This is all about identity. And if you look like these cultural issues that I was just talking about, and to be this low means that our experts are ranking you as really traditional authoritarian nationalists. Hungary is interesting because Hungary, again, you see Fidesz on the left in terms of economic left-right. And you see Fidesz's change from being in 2010, according to our experts, a pro-EU party, today very much a triangle to the European Union. And then you also see that Fidesz has become even more traditional authoritarian nationalist and actually dislodged the extreme right party in Hungary. Orbán felt very strongly that he did not want to have any party that was to the more traditional authoritarian and nationalist than him, and actually, but this party system also tells us that there's no competition on economic policies. This is just now about, progressive, democratic, pro-EU versus authoritarian, majoritarian, populist. And it's become, in Hungary and elsewhere, what you would call sort of a pro-democracy and anti-democracy parties. And in Poland, we did have that at the last election. You have a more varied party system, but essentially at the last elections, all of these parties, not Confederacja, not PiS, but all of these parties were working together as the pro-democracy coalition. I think I read an article in the paper today about how in the United States, our upcoming elections are also now going to be heavily, that actually American voters are now putting democracy and equality of democracy as one of their first concern, because our elections too have now shifted. They're not as much about economic policy or even about immigration. I think our elections in this country have now shifted into, for democracy against democracy, for liberal democracy versus for some transmutation or majoritarian democracy. Okay, we already mentioned this, in terms of substance, it's really these ethnopopulist parties, many of whom are former conservative parties. Some of them are more upstarts, like in Italy, being remodeled with ethnopopulism and therefore reaching a much broader constituency than the old far-right ethnic nationalist parties. And we have just some really striking consequences, right? Authoritarian rule within the European Union, yikes, Hungary, and of course Brexit in the UK, and this kind of regime divide between a group of parties. One way to kind of test this is, when an election's coming up and you think, well, if this party or this set of party wins elections, are they going to degrade the playing field, make it less equal, more skewed for the next elections come around? So the last decade, as I mentioned, suggests that there are pretty different outcomes in Europe. So when we've had left populist parties in power, and we don't have a lot of examples, but Syriza's probably one that really stands out. Before Syriza took power, there was a lot of articles written by the center-right folks who like to come to American universities. There's a big policy community, and there's a lot of fear that Syriza would come and attack democratic institutions. But in fact, Syriza in power moderated, became, and they wouldn't like to hear me say it, but kind of just a normal left-wing European political party. Also embraced the EU. Whereas when ethnopopulists come to power, we really don't see that kind of moderation. We can't say that the time that the Freedom Party in Austria spent in a coalition moderated it in any way. In fact, it lost power because of a spectacular scandal showing that Putin and the Kremlin were directly funding the party, and there's all this corruption and so forth. But they haven't moderated at all. Salvini was in the coalition with Italy for a brief period of time. We don't see any moderation on his part, and certainly not Viktor Orban's party in Hungary or Law and Justice in Poland, or the ANO government in the Czech Republic, which I write about a lot. Now, the other thing for the EU, and this is, am I at 30 minutes? Yeah. Okay, great. These parties, sometimes people say, well, we've had bumpy rides in EU countries before, where we've had governments that seem to undermine the politics of democracy. So Berlusconi in Italy, for example, with his attack on the independence of the judiciary, his attacks on the media. But Berlusconi, we were talking about this a couple of days ago, he tended to keep his democratic backsliding inside Italy. He wasn't trying to spread it. Whereas these ethnopopulists, they do learn from each other, they do campaign for one another. Sometimes that backfires. When Viktor Orban came to the Czech Republic to campaign for Babiš, I think it really hurt Babiš. And they also tried to attack the EU in terms of reducing its competences and decoupling it from liberal democracy. So if Orban or Salvini or others had their way, I don't think they would eliminate the European Union, but they would make it regime agnostic. We don't care if you're an authoritarian regime or democracy. Let's do some things that help us be wealthy. And what you see them now doing is essentially acting as Trojan horses, as one of my colleagues called it, or kind of brokers for authoritarian regimes around the world. Orban says, hey, you want me to block this EU foreign policy thing? Sure, I'll do it, but give me something, give me some money, give me an energy deal or whatnot. And we've seen that over and over and over again with some pretty dramatic examples. Okay, you guys already know this, I'm sure, but these ethno-populist politicians tend to have like 9 lives, 20 lives. I mean, Boris Johnson finally went down, but not until we thought he should have gone down like 50 times over. And the amount of kind of hypocrisy, and I think that's a really interesting area to study. It comes from the changed information environment, social media, polarization. But the way that they're kind of able to campaign for one thing, say one thing, and then do something very different has really been stunning for me. So I keep this slide in because I think it sort of helps us think about that. One of the things which really is worrying to me is climate change, right? They may say that they want to help the ordinary person, and they may even mention climate change and other things. But we've seen that when they're in power, they're actually going exactly the opposite, which is they're making deals with energy companies and big banks and not putting forward policies that help climate change. And part of that is regulation. Like when you have a government that's intent on sort of smashing democratic institutions and concentrating power, they'll start rewriting the regulations even more dramatically to suit them and interests in their circle. And we've seen a lot of that even in very democratic governments like Germany. Okay, and finally what they do is this conflation of liberal democracy and neoliberal economic reforms. This is something that's also done by journalists and scholars and think takers all the time, and it's one of my real, like, it bugs me. And my students who've taken my class have heard me complain about this. You know, liberal democracy is a it's a system for organizing the polity, for establishing where political legitimacy comes from, for deciding how democratic institutions are going to work, and the rights and freedoms and obligations that institutions, officials, and citizens have. Neoliberal economic policies are a policy choice, and they're a policy choice that some liberal democracies have made. You can certainly make the argument that liberal democracy has opened the doors to private power and made it easy for big money to advocate for neoliberal economic policies, things like deregulation, lowering taxation, distribution, but they're not synonymous, right? And we have a huge variety of how different liberal democracies have chosen to deal with neoliberal economic policies, right? There was a moment in the 90s where both the Democrats and the Republicans in the US embraced these. Both the left and the right in the UK embraced neoliberal economic policies. So I think this was going to lead to entrepreneurship and high growth and trickle down, and you're all familiar with that. But the conflation of the two is really damaging. When scholars make arguments like, oh, Eastern Europe has turned away from liberalism, it makes me nuts. There are a lot of East Europeans, just like there are a lot of West Europeans and a lot of Americans who think neoliberal economic policies are bad policies and should be stopped and reversed. And there are others who are convinced by these kind of ethnopopulist parties that liberal democracy causes these neoliberal economic reforms that cause these bad things. But that's not accurate, right? And we have countries like in Europe that have taken a much more measured approach and not implemented these policies when they were so fashionable over the last 25 years. Okay. I just want to shift a little bit to what I think is going to happen in terms of, or what is happening in terms of the impact of the war in Ukraine on European politics, and then I will open it up for questions. We have a really interesting split where you have some ethno-populist governments who have gone all in to help Ukraine, and the Polish government has done a lot. It's like invaluable help to them. They have also used it to try to improve their image as European statesmen, and also to kind of deflect from how they're attacking the independent judiciary and really degrading democracy. And I think the next elections in Poland are going to be decisive. We saw the Prime Minister of Slovenia taking one of the first trains to Kyiv in an attempt to soften his image, because this was also a pretty nasty ethno-populist party, and he lost. So it's an interesting kind of way. Salvini went to the border to try to help Ukrainian refugees. Anybody remember this story? And he was met with the mayor, the Polish mayor of the town, who had a T-shirt on with a picture of him and Putin embracing or something. So it was, and then the Polish mayor kicked him out. So guess so, and then there's another group that's really digging in, and of course Viktor Orban is number one in that group, in that he is, continues to be very close to Putin and unapologetically, right? So it's really interesting. If we wanted to be really optimistic, we could say, okay, Russia's war against Ukraine at enormous, unfathomable, and heartbreaking cost to the Ukrainian people is having some positive effects on European politics, right? It's kind of exposing the hypocrisy of these ethnopopulist parties. It's undermining support for, it's sort of making these parties who took money from the Kremlin, and mimicked the Kremlin in terms of saying these hateful things about groups they claim are culturally harmful. This whole rhetoric, to some extent, is maybe discredited. And, not only because of the war, but maybe in part, maybe, how in this country elections are really close. Like in Czech Republic, elections next time will be really close. The Polish elections will be really close. And so it might just help tip the balance in elections against these ethnopopulist parties that are, in many cases, linked so clearly and explicitly to the Kremlin. And the reason I talk about a sense of urgency, I don't think I really made this clear, is that these regimes where they've had power in Poland and Hungary, but also arguably elsewhere, including the UK, their number one goal is to stay in power, right? All politicians want to stay in power. They want to prevent turnover. But they're willing to go into great lengths to sort of fix the political playing field. And so with every successive term that they win, the next elections are more impossible for the opposition to win. And that's where we've gotten to Hungary. There were elections in Hungary in April. There was very little chance the opposition, even though all the opposition parties were cooperating, they all agreed finally on one candidate, one figurehead. Each party had 15 minutes of television time, full stop. The Orban regime controls the television completely. They had 15 minutes, that was it for the entire campaign. Whereas the TV is covering Orban and the Orban government constantly. Opposition politicians are harassed. All of the independent media has been shut down. So there's lots of ways, right, in which as they attack institutions, each successive election becomes less and less free and fair and more impossible for the opposition to win. And so there is a sense of urgency, and the European Union really missed the boat in large part due to Germany in terms of trying to stop and sanction Orban for the democratic backsliding that he was pulling off in Hungary. Okay, and that's not so the big questions, right? Will this help the EU find the political will to confront attacks on liberal democracy among EU members? Because this will reach a crisis. Like the EU cannot, I think, function with multiple authoritarian regimes inside of it. And we can talk about that, but a lot of the tools of foreign policy it uses, but also just the way that the EU itself thinks of itself and legitimizes its own existence and power is anchored in liberal democracy. And so if this becomes decoupled, the EU and liberal democracy, it'll create a huge rift. Some governments, Holland, Northern, there'll be governments who say, well, we're not going to be part of this, right? Right now, you see sort of Orban pulling away, potentially others that are on the populist far right regimes. But what about regimes that see themselves solidly, as liberal Democrats and then lose commitment to the EU? So that's a real problem, and the EU really must do more to address it. The other thing that might happen, and is happening, I think, is that we see the large countries, and here Germany and France, they have been Well, let's start with Germany. Germany has played this game over the last 15, 20 years where the German government, both on the CDU and the SPD, have both been squarely here, somehow thinking about buying energy from Russia as a purely economic endeavor. And even though the American government and many think tanks and many European partners have been telling the Germans for up to 2 decades that, doing business with the Kremlin, with Russia, buying all this energy from them is not just an economic transaction. It is profoundly impacting the distribution of power in Europe, and it's giving Russia enormous leverage. What it was also doing is pumping corruption directly into both the SPD and the CDU. And that's hard to take, right? Because, now there's sort of a mea culpa, right? Because Nord Stream 2 has been canceled. The German government it's a new government. Scholz is a great leader, in my opinion. Sadly, when we needed a great leader in Germany, they are realizing, right, that they're going to have to stop buying Russian energy. They're taking steps to do that as quickly as they think they can. But one of the problems in terms of European solidarity and European integration is that when we had the 2008 financial crisis, Greece and other countries, but mainly Greece, was in terrible shape, right? You had hunger, you had huge rise in hardship for ordinary Greeks. And the German attitude was, well, you guys borrowed this money and you couldn't pay it off, so suck it up. You made a mistake, you got to deal with it. And now, you say the same things to the Germans and they're really not very responsive. I mean, we have some Germans here, but the idea that you would say, oh, wow, we really screwed up in buying all this Russian energy, and now we do need to take a hit to our economy by cutting it off quickly. That is not happening. And so a lot of Germany's partners are pretty upset about this, sense that they're not willing to do enough more quickly to make up for their mistake. And don't, in my opinion, this was a tremendous mistake, which led directly to the war. I mean, the amount of money that European countries transfer into the Kremlin's budget every single month is astronomical to this day in terms of buying Russian energy, particularly natural gas. In France, we also have a moment where France could have seized the leadership of Europe in terms of helping Ukraine, but really didn't. You guys remember all those long phone calls with Putin and the endless mines, It's like Macron went to de Gaulle, right? He went to this okay, we're going to be like this, France is going to be powerful again by being this third pillar, by being this independent broker. I'm going to call Putin and I'm going to call Zelensky and I'm going to call Biden. And this is somehow going to improve French power. Well, in my view, this didn't help French power. It would be much more helpless if Macron had put himself as kind of the leader of Europe's, of all the European states who want to help Ukraine. And definitely not spend a lot of time on the phone with Putin. Okay, I think I'll end there. And I think I have I have one more slide. Well, what I hope in terms of an optimistic and is that there will be this revival of the EU enlargement process, and that this will help the EU sort of regain its footing in terms of a geopolitical actor. It's a very good foreign policy tool that the EU hasn't been using lately, and I think it can use it very effectively. And by reviving a kind of meritocratic process for enlargement, it can help not just Ukraine, which I think is going to do really well in a meritocratic process once the war is over, but also help North Macedonia and Montenegro that have been left waiting because of just here. And I want to end with this nice slide about the protesters, because everywhere, we have seen really, a lot of people look at democratic backsliding and you think, okay, this shows a weakness in these democracies. And that's true, it does. But what also you see is an incredible bottom-up organization and protest against these backsliding regimes. And that shows a strength of these countries. And that's not, Poland, that's Czech Republic, Slovakia. We've also seen big protests in Italy, Germany, France. There's been a lot of civic participation. the United States. And so I think that's a really positive part. Here, my protester here is saying things are so bad, even the Czechs have started to pray. The Czech Republic is a famously secular, non-religious country. And then Jan Hus Power is, well, he was one of our heroes, Protestant reformist. So this was for the protests against the Babiš government, which has since been voted out of power. So it's a success story in terms of voting these kinds of backsliding regimes out. All right.